Good morning, everybody. This is Stephen Pugh of the Home Bible College. I want to do another episode in my series on the King James Version. And today we're looking at the divine name. This is chapter 10. And in the Old Testament, the divine names, there's a lot of divine names, a lot of special names or titles and designations for God. And the first one, impoverishes the richness of the biblical language and reduces the galaxy of words to one single term if the only word we've got is God. But of course, that isn't how the Bible is, and there's a huge list of names for God. The most important one is what we call the Tetragrammaton, which is YHWH, which for convenience, we use the word Jehovah or Yahweh. The Jewish writers believed that the word was too sacred to be stated, and so they used the word Adonai in deference to this. And the King James Bible can be said to have had a considerable influence on English ways of referring to God by translating WH as Lord. And whenever you see the word Lord in the King James Version in capitals, Lord, then you'll know that it's actually Yahweh, which is the word that's being translated. This is nothing, of course, to do with Jehovah's Witnesses, nothing at all to do with people who are not Christians. And then we have the New Testament Greek. Now, there are some issues of translation with the New Testament Greek. The New Testament was written entirely in Greek, with the exception of a few words which are drawn from the Aramaic, and yet to the Oxford and Cambridge educated classicists, the King James Version companies, it must have seemed a very strange form of Greek. You see, it appeared the Greek of the New Testament appeared to have little relation to classical Greek of Plato and Aristotle or Homer. Certainly the Greek of some New Testament documents, such as the letter to the Hebrews and the first letter of Peter, can be thought of as being truly literary, using a form of language that is clearly classical in origin and influence, but many passages in the Gospel, especially those relating to the conversation of ordinary people, seem to belong to a different linguistic world, one that is now lost to us. Even as late as 1852, the form of Greek found in the New Testament continued to puzzle scholars. Lecturing at the University of Cambridge in 1855, the great New Testament scholar J.B. Lightfoot remarked, "If we could only recover letters that ordinary people wrote to each other without any thought of being literary, we would have the greatest possible help for the understanding of the New Testament generally." What's very interesting is that in the late 19th century, significant advances were made in understanding everyday Greek of the Eastern Mediterranean world in which Christianity was born. The German scholar Adolf Dreismann noted remarkable similarities between the Greek of the New Testament and a series of vernacular papyri and other documents of that period. The type of Greek in question is often referred to as Koine, an everyday Greek of the first century. From many papyri, there is fragments of paper. These are fragments of paper made from papyrus on which small portions of text are written, as well as fragments of poetry and pottery and other items recovered from ancient rubbish dumps, especially in Egypt, where the dry air aided conservation. It has become clear that the Greek spoken at the time of the New Testament had moved on considerably from that of the classical period, 400 or 500 years earlier, in much the same way that English has moved on considerably from 1611. Today's reader of the King James Bible is able to read the text without too much difficulty, but is aware that it is written in the English of a much earlier period. And this raises an important point concerning the companies of translators assembled by King James. There's no doubt that they included some of the finest classical scholars of the period, well used to dealing with questions of translation in classical Greek, and yet the Greek they were being asked to translate dates from much later, and seems to follow more fluid grammatical rules. To translate it on the basis of an earlier form of Greek would cause lots of difficulties. Words change their meaning over time. For example, in 1611, the word let often had the sense of hinder or prevent. And the word prevent then meant something like to go before or to precede. Shifts in meaning can easily lead to misunderstandings of what an older translation meant. Consider what the King James says in Psalm 59 verse 10. It reads, "The God of my mercy shall prevent me." Actually, in modern English, it would read, "The God of my mercy shall go before me." So the word prevent doesn't mean to stop you or to protect you. It means to go ahead of you. It's to prevent. Okay. Now, there's little doubt that the King James translators worked on the assumption that the same vocabulary rules of grammar that applied to the classical period would also apply to the New Testament, and this was not always the case, and can lead to some serious misjudgments in the translation. For example, the word apates generally bears the meaning of meeting. Okay, the King James translators used this translation without any particular hesitation, and as it made sense in every case. For example, as in Luke's account of the Roman Christian coming out to meet Paul as he travelled along the Appian Way. From thence, when the brethren heard us, they came to meet us as far as Apithorum. Now, the word apantes at the time, it meant an official welcome for a distinguished visitor who had just arrived. The word came to refer not a meeting, but a special kind of meeting. It was an official delegation sent to welcome a distinguished visitor. And so that is the way in which we should understand that word today. So, although the King James Bible rarely leads its readers astray through lack of familiarity with the Koine Greek, it occasionally fails to bring out the full depth of meaning in passages for this reason. The Koine Greek of the New Testament is actually the everyday Greek language of the working people rather than self-conscious literary scholars and poets. The King James Version translators were completely oblivious to this fact. The language of the workplace and the market is thus subtly changed into the high candaces of the Palace of Westminster and the high tables of Oxford and Cambridge. Many readers of the King James Bible often comment on its elegance and its excellence of style, and yet the considerations just set out mean that on occasion the style and the elegance will be those of the translators rather than the passages that they translate. Okay, that sounds like an awful lot. Listen to this again, by the way. If you're not understanding any of these sentences, then just click it on and listen again. Now, when we come to the Gospels, the synoptic issue, the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are often known as the synoptic Gospels. They borrow from one another, either consciously or unconsciously, and sometimes a synoptic gospel, when it's narrating a particular incident, may use exactly the same words in the original documents. However, that's because they would have committed these gospels to heart and to memory, and that comes out then in things that are then subsequently said. So some of the material is common to all three gospels. What's very interesting is that in the Greek, the passages would be identical in every word, or pretty well identical in every word. The translators did not feel that it was exactly the case that they would have to translate any of these passages identically. So evidence suggests that the Second Oxford Company of Translators, who were responsible for translating the Gospels, did not see things in this light, and they tended to translate freely without having to be bound by other texts of the Bible which were already translated. Now, let me just say something else. Secondly, the observations which led scholars to reflect on the nature of the Synoptic Gospels had not been fully coordinated in the 17th century. Indeed, it could be argued that 2 more centuries would pass before the matter was given proper attention. The translators were therefore not alerted to the issues which are taken for granted in biblical translation circles today. And so these passages that are identical in the Gospels are referred to as the Gospel parallels. They're exactly the same words being translated. Now, the casual reader might gain the impression that quite different Greek words are being translated in each passage. In fact, the Greek words are identical in every case. And the King James translators were just simply not aware of the parallelism between the text. Now, at first sight, the question of the identity of the text to be translated might seem to be so simple that it doesn't need any comment. However, the 16th century saw important new developments in biblical translation. Erasmus in Rotterdam produced a printed Greek text of the New Testament in 1516, which called into question some of the Latin translations found in the Vulgate. Erasmus was obliged to compile his Greek text on the basis of various manuscripts that he was able to consult. None of these were very ancient. Erasmus had to work on the basis of the criteria of accessibility. He could only translate from what he had access to. Okay, and as far as can be ascertained, none of the half-dozen manuscripts, he had only 6 manuscripts to translate from, were earlier than the 10th century. I'll say that again. None of the texts, the manuscripts, were earlier than the 10th century. So, anywhere 1,000 years after the documents were originally written. That's the earliest that they could go back to. Erasmus' issue of the Greek text of the New Testament was revised over the next century, so the next 100 years. And the Parisian printer Robert Estienne produced a number of editions based on Erasmus' text, as did the Genevan theologian and biblical scholar Theodore Beza did later. It is known that the King James translators made use of Beza's edition of the Greek text in the New Testament. It was, after all, the best edition of the text that was then available. The particular version of the text that became known as the Textus Receptus, or the received text, not because of any official church judgment or decision, but simply because the New Testament scholars based their work on it. That's the only reason. It must be pointed out that although this was somewhat a technical matter, the Textus Receptus is not to be directly identified with a Byzantine text. The form of text that established itself during the period of ecclesiastical and theological consolidation in the Eastern Roman Empire from the 4th century onwards. We mustn't mix up the difference between the received text and yet biblical scholarship had advanced considerably over the years. Much older manuscripts of the New Testament, or parts of it, have come to light since that time. The richness of the New Testament manuscript tradition can be appreciated by considering another work dating from around the same time. Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, a famous account of the Roman wars in France, written around 550 BC. The oldest known manuscript of this text dates from 900 years after Caesar's time. Now let's let you think about that for a minute. 900 years past. since Caesar's time. That's how far back we can go. Not very far at all. It's nearly 1,000 years between the two. Okay, similarly, the oldest manuscript of Thydes's history, which was written sometime in the 5th century before Christ, was written down 1,400 years later. 1,400 years. That's a very long time. In the 16th century, the best editions of the Greek New Testament were based on manuscripts dating from no earlier than the 10th century. We've said that. But since then, many new manuscripts have been discovered, of which the most famous is the Codex Sinaiticus, probably written in about the 4th century. Got that now? See the difference between the 10th century and the 4th century. This was found in the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai in 1844. It's now held in the British Museum. By the way, I've had a look at that. It's very, very interesting to see that. And the Codex Alexandrinus, probably written in the 5th century, was presented to King Charles I in 1627 by the Patriarch of Alexandria. Theodore Beza himself presented an early New Testament, Greek New Testament, to the University of Cambridge in 1581. This contains the 4 Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles in both Greek and Latin. It's thought to date from the 5th and 6th centuries. A vast range of papyri have also been found. As a result, it's as much more accurate edition of the New Testament is accessible than the King James translators ever knew. Now just bear in mind, the King James translators had 6 manuscripts to work from, and they were from the 10th century. Got that? Now nowadays, there are thousands upon thousands of texts to refer to, and they go all the way back to about the 2nd century. That's quite amazing. It must be made immediately clear that this does not call into account the general reliability of the King James Version. The issue concerns minor textual variations. Not a single teaching of the Christian Church is affected by these variations, nor of any major historical aspect of the gospel narratives or early Christianity is affected. The important point is this, that in general, the King James Bible is based on the Textus Receptus, and scholarly fashions have changed. The Alexandrian text and the Codex of Alexandrinus is now preferred within the scholarly community to the Byzantine text, which the Textus Receptus reflects. Okay, it's worth noting a remarkable exception to the statement made above by the King James Bible, which followed Erasmus's text. The point is best understood by comparing the translation of 1 John 5, 7 and 8 offered by the King James Bible and the Revised Standard Version. Now the King James Bible says this, "For there are 3 that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these 3 are one. And there are 3 that bear witness on earth, the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these 3 agree in one." Now the Revised Standard Version says this, "And the Spirit is the witness, because the Spirit is the truth. There are 3 witnesses, the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these 3 agree." Now it's more than just a translation problem here. The translations seem to be based on different texts altogether. Now the words, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these 3 are one, and there are 3 that bear witness on earth, is not found in any Greek manuscript, any early Greek manuscript. They were added later to the Latin Vulgate, probably at about 800 AD, despite not being known in any Greek version of ancient history. The most likely explanation is that these words were initially added as a gloss. Now, a gloss is a brief comment set aside or above the text, which a later scribe misunderstood to be something that should be added to the text itself, and subsequent scribes basing themselves on this faulty copy, then include the words in later Latin text. They are not part of the original Greek text of the New Testament. That is an established fact of history. For Erasmus, the solution was simple. The words should be deleted, or they were not part of the New Testament. There was a late addition to the Latin Vulgate text. They have no right to be there. So their removal would not cause anybody to lose any sleep at night, and yet the translators of the King James Bible appear to have felt that tradition demanded that the additional words could be retained. Subsequent revisions of English translations have, of course, removed the words which are manifestly inauthentic. However, this is an exceptional case. In general, the variations between the Textus Receptus and the Codex Alexandrinus are interesting, but they are slight. As the following two examples show, they are drawn from the translation work of the Second Oxford Company, responsible for the translation of the Gospels. When you read the Lord's Prayer in Matthew chapter 6, 9 to 13, you'll see that the Textus Receptus here includes what is known as a doxology. That is the closing section of praise. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Now that phrase is not found in any of the early Greek manuscripts. It is therefore not included in later English translations such as the Revised Standard Version. However, the influence of the King James Version was such that this closing section is still included in the traditional form of the Lord's Prayer and has largely resisted all attempts to eliminate it. Now, the second is in Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 to 44, in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the phrase, "Bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you," is not found in most Greek manuscripts and is therefore omitted from the modern English translations. None of these alterations are earth-shattering, yet they are interesting in their own right, and they cast important light on the strengths and the weaknesses of the King James Version. Now, New Testament scholarship now regards the Alexandrian text of the New Testament to be the most authentic, and the King James Bible is based on what is now seen as a slightly less reliable text. This is a sufficient reason for revising the translation. Now, another one of the things that comes up in the King James Bible is the question of poetry. The Bible contains a wide range of literary styles. What's very interesting is that the King James Version never used poetic style in the form of its text. Normally with a narrative, it run across the line from end to end and can go continuously down the page. If a hymn was found in the middle of that narrative, then it would continue in the normal format on the line. It would not go to the convention that's used for poetry and put it in a poetic style. Okay? And so poetry and prose are not conveyed in a conventional manner in the King James Version, and this produces a major problem because it doesn't help the reader to understand that we have a section of poetry here. That doesn't do that because it's the shape of the text that does that. Tyndale's New Testament often presented the text with considerable sensitivity to the literary styles involved. Okay, in Luke 1, Tyndale lays his text out in prose, in paragraphs where appropriate, and then as lines of poetry when presenting the Magnificat, the Song of Mary. And so now this means that Tyndale was very sensitive to the difference between prose and poetry, but the King James Version didn't do that at all, and that was a major setback for the King James Version. So what is a translation anyway? Now, these issues are addressed by Miles Smith in the preface, or the translators to the reader at the beginning of the King James Version. He says the decision not to translate each Hebrew or Greek word exactly the same exactly the same with an English word on every occasion was not necessary. So, for example, we have a Hebrew word which is kahida. It's translated in a number of ways. It's translated as a riddle. It's translated as a hard question. It's translated as a dark saying. And it's also translated as a dark sentence. So the King James Version translators did not constrain themselves when translating. They would use phrases which they didn't use in other places. Now, when they were discussing how translation was done, they had a number of principles, 3 in particular. They said, we will, number 1, ensure that every word in the original is rendered by an English equivalent. But that wasn't always what they did at all. They were, number 2, to make it clear that any added words to make the sense clearer or to lead to better English syntax, these words were originally indicated in Roman type, and the remainder of the biblical text being typeset in black letter type. In recent times, as indicated by italics, following the precedent of the Geneva Bible. However, that's not always the case. And as we pointed out right at the very beginning of these studies, if you take a look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, you'll look at the Greek text, you'll find that there's 8 words. But when you look at the King James Version, you'll find there's 16 words, and then none of those extra words are not in italics. And so the ordinary English reader could be mistaken for thinking that every one of those 16 words is from the Greek. Of course, it's not from the Greek. And also, number 3, that they should follow the basic word order of the original wherever possible. Now, there were times when they did do this, and it didn't read very beautiful in English. But most of the time they did not, and they turned the word order around in such a way that it sounded good in English. So, this is incredibly interesting, isn't it? The resulting text of the King James Version was that it was recognizably English, and secondly, it was intelligible. People could understand it. It was much more literal and formal than other translations have been. The essential Hebrew ways of speaking were then incorporated into the English language. And for this reason, the King James Bible has had a highly significant impact on the development of the English language, a matter that deserves to be considered in greater detail in the next chapter. So that's going to be chapter 11. So this is the end of this particular video. We wish you every blessing, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Bye for now. God bless you.